Howdy everybody. I'm standing here in one of these 11 swales that we have here on the property. Now, when I took my permaculture design certificate course with Jeff Lawton, one of the first things I wanted to do when I came back home was to dig some swales. And I was under the impression that swales are appropriate for almost any place. And in fact, I recently published a video about swales, which I put down here in the description. You can watch if you want. It's called A Game Changer for Many Farms. And swales are a game changer for many farms, but they're not appropriate for all farms. And so the context in which your land exists is going to determine whether or not you're going to decide to incorporate swales into your farming efforts. And remember this, just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. So there are 6 main factors to take into consideration when you're deciding whether or not you want to implement swales on your property. Those are your resource base, the type of soils that you have, the ecosystem condition in which your land exists. So your land doesn't exist in a vacuum, it exists in a context. How you're going to manage the farm, your hydrology, and then the slope of your land. So those 6 factors are very important to consider. And I want to go through each one of them in a little bit more detail. So first, let's consider your resource base. What do we mean by that? If you don't have a lot of equipment, if you don't have access to good workers, if you don't have access to funds, you're doing things on a shoestring budget, which is okay. I do everything on a shoestring budget, so there's nothing to be ashamed about that. But there's a practical consideration. Also, if you don't have a lot of time, time is a big resource. Swales take time to engineer. So if you don't have a lot of time and you really need to get things going as quick as possible, then maybe you should not jump into doing swales and either postpone doing swales on your property or not do them at all, depending on what the other factors tell you. So the next thing to consider is the type of soil that you have. And this is important because you don't want to be wasting your time and your resources in your efforts. So if your soil is fertile, it's deep, and it's well drained, then why would you dig a swale? Remember that the purpose of a swale is to spread and soak water. If you already have soils that are capable of doing that, in other words, they're deep, which means that they're going to be able to take in a lot of water and hold it, then you're wasting your time digging swales because the water is going to infiltrate anyway. On the other hand, if you're like us, where the distance of the soil to the bedrock is very shallow and the bedrock is relatively impermeable, then that is good for building swales. Because if you don't, the water isn't going to seep into the ground naturally. It's just going to run off the ground. It's going to go off in sheets, or it's going to go down in gullies that are made. So if your soils are kind of like ours, then this is a great environment to dig swales. It's also the most difficult to dig them. That takes more resources because it's difficult to dig down to the rock. The ground is typically very hard. I'm up here a little bit higher on one of the other swales. Now, the third thing that you want to consider is the condition of your ecosystem. Basically, what I'm saying is, what type of ecosystem are you in? Are you in an ecosystem that has a lot of old trees, what we'd call an old growth forest? That's what is called a climax ecosystem. The other side of that, which is what we encountered on this land, was basically just a lot of grass and shrubs and a lot of spiny shrubs. That's an ecosystem that is in the beginning of succession. this used to be a montane forest, a cloud forest. And people came centuries ago and cleared all the land, cut down all the trees, and we're left with what we have now. So this is a piece of land that is then in the early stages of succession. It wants to return to a forest. And again, returning to what we already discussed, the amount of resources, in other words, the amount of inputs that it would take to chop down an old-growth forest just so that you could run a swale across the property is completely impractical. That brings up another issue. What is your management of your land going to be? Do you have a lot of land, which means that you may want to have some machinery? Do you have a small plot of land in which machinery might not be as big of a deal for you? But machinery and swales don't go very well together. And it's an access issue. We have all these swales here. We don't use machinery on the farm. So machinery access is not a factor that we even consider. So if you're going to be using machinery, you probably want to think twice about whether or not you want to be digging swales on the property. Another factor to consider is if you're going to have animals on your farm. Remember that a swale is a tree-growing system. So if you're going to be raising goats, you want to keep the goats away from the trees. If you're going to be raising sheep, you have to keep the sheep away from the trees. Otherwise, they'll start chewing on the bark of the trees and kill them. So you want to think about access for your animals, where your access laneway is going to be for your paddocks. You might not want to have swales at all if you're going to have animals on your property. Now these last two items, hydrology and slope of land, I saved to the last because I wanted to make sure to emphasize them. The hydrology of your land is an extremely important factor to consider. Now, in the last video that I published, I talked about brittle and non-brittle environments. And that's what we're talking about when we're speaking about the hydrology of your land. In other words, is your land basically moist most of the year round? Then you're leaning toward a non-brittle environment. If you're on the other side of that and you're in a brittle environment and there's times of the year when it absolutely is not moist, like here, that is a big consideration. Now, why is that? If you have a moist soil, and your rain is fairly regular. I know with climate change, all of that is altering in various places, but if the soil moisture level is good, the last thing you want to do is to dig a swale, especially if you're on a heavy slope, because that land, if you get rain, can go into a landslide, and you don't want that to happen. You don't want to wake up in the middle of the night and maybe there's a rainstorm and suddenly you hear a rumbling and you wake up the next morning and your field that used to be up above is down below now. And it's all because you oversaturated the ground. And that is the final thing. If your land has a slope that is between 3 and 15%, then if all of the other factors kind of line up, swales might be a good solution for you. If it's below 3%, that means your land is close to flat. You're not going to get the kind of sheeting effect of the rain coming, of the water coming down. The water is going to stay on the flat land. And the gravity aspect of the swale is that once you collect water in the swale, the gravity is what makes it go down and soak in more. So if it's above 15%, you have another problem. And that is that the pressure of the water coming down can blow out your swales, create a lot of erosion. So it isn't a good option. Now, you may be wondering, how do I determine the slope of my land? Well, I'm glad you asked that because that's the subject of my next video. Do you have to hire somebody, an engineer to come in and do it? No, you don't. I'm going to give you a very inexpensive and very easy way to determine the slope of your land. With that, I'm going to sign off until the next video, and thank you very much for watching.